Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on Spring Boot and IntelliJ IDEA. Before we start, I would like to ask a few questions. So first question is, who's using Spring Boot already? Okay, that's 50%. Who's using IntelliJ IDEA?
Oh.
That's 50%. So those who are not using IntelliJ, what are you using? Are you using Eclipse? Yeah. Or STS, yeah, sorry. NetBeans? I have one guy using NetBeans there?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're the guy using NetBeans. Okay. Oh, sorry. So my name is Stéphane Nicoll. I'm working for Pivotal. I'm working on the Spring Boot project. And this is my friend Yann.
Yeah, my name is Yann Cébron. I work for JetBrains, and I'm responsible for the Spring and Spring Boot framework support in IntelliJ IDEA.
Right. So let's get started with a lot of slides. Right? That's it. All right. So you already knew about starterspring.io. You get an extensive demo yesterday at the keynote, or if you were to the Spring Cloud session this morning, an extensive showcase of that. So I'm not going to show you that again. But what's really interesting is if you're using IntelliJ IDEA, you can basically interact with that service right away, right from the IDE. So I'm going to create a new project that we're going to use today. So I'm going to select Create New Project, Spring Initializer. Then I can choose which service I want to connect to. If by any chance you have your own customization of starterspring.io, actually you could do that. But I'm just going to use the regular service for it. I'm going to just keep the default, not making the jar versus war joke. I guess you already heard that before. Keeping all those defaults is fine. I'm going to use the latest. And I don't want to focus too much time on Spring Boot itself, so I'm going to create very quickly a simple application. So I'm going to use security, web, JPA for some reason. We made that joke again, I know. H2, the actuator, because it's cool. What did I miss? Oh, REST repositories. Right? OK. And I'm going to call that Spring 1 demo. So if you do that, basically what you get is you get a project. So it's actually contacting starterspring.io with the things that you've configured, downloading the project, extracting the project where you've decided, and set up everything. So what we're going to do today, because you may have heard about the Spring Boot support in IntelliJ 14. This is IntelliJ 15 EAP with some patches that I received yesterday, by the way.
Yes, we are on the bleeding edge here.
So consider that IntelliJ 15 snapshot. So if everything breaks, yeah, you know it, right? So anyway, I want to show you what's new in IntelliJ IDEA 15, so that if you're using IntelliJ 14, you can see the difference. So the first thing that's new here is the project got created automatically. So you don't have to refresh it or ask to import the Maven POM. It's basically done automatically. The new thing also is that you get a run configuration created out of the box, so you can start the app immediately. And the last thing which is new in IntelliJ 15 is that the Spring facet, is auto-detected, so you don't have to create it. And we'll come to that later. So very quickly, I'm going to create a domain model for a speaker. So I have that prepared for you. The content is not really interesting, right? It's just a simple GP entity. A repository. I have that here as well. Using Spring Data, you probably have seen that in the past. And I want to make sure that I have instances in my data store every time I start. So I'm going to use some speakers here. So import.sql, if you don't know about that, it's a feature from Hibernate, which basically allows you to run any SQL statement that you want when the schema is created. So if I start that, then I get an app with a bunch of features. So let's see what we have here. Oh, right. So I need to log in. I added the security starter, so I need to be able to log in. And what Spring Boot does, it creates a default user called user. Anybody knows what the password might be? No, wrong. So the password is generated every time the application starts. That's really, really much smarter. And, oh, that's true, I have that stuff. And then I have my speakers created here, right? So that was easy, very fast. So this password is actually going to be generated at every run. So it's going to change every time I start the app. And it's made in such a way that there's no way you can remember it. So we'll have to fix that. And also to show you quickly the info endpoint, which for now is empty, but we're going to fix that. Yeah, so let's see how IntelliJ IDEA can help us customizing that app. So the first thing, for those who don't know that at all, probably not much in the audience anyway, is Spring Boot has a very rich configuration model. So when you use auto configuration and you want Spring Boot to change slightly the way the auto configuration is applied, you can customize it with configuration keys. And one of the problems with those configuration keys is that you have to remember them, or you have to find them via Google, the documentation, or Stack Overflow, whatnot. So what those guys have built in IntelliJ IDEA is content assistance right in the IDE based on the configuration that is available in your project. So I want to change the password. So let me type pass. And then I get content assistance about the options that are available to me. And you can see that I can see the name of the key, obviously, some documentation, and the type. So let's say I'm going to say change me. And that will change my the default password for the default user. The next thing I want to say is, I went too quick on that one, by the way. When I had the authentication pop-up, it told me that the realm was Spring, because that's the default value, and I want to change that. So I type realm. I can see the default value. There were no default value for the password, but there is for this one. So I can see directly right in the IDE what the default value for that key is. And I'm going to say something like hello, and I'm going a feature from boot, which is a random property source. So I'm going to say, give me a number between 0 and 5, and use that as a realm. Obviously, that's completely stupid, but it's just to show you that the integration with property source in IntelliJ IDEA is pretty deep. Then I want to change the role of my user. So I type role. And I can see that I have the security user.role. We can't see that because the font is bigger, but actually it's a list. So if I do that, I get basically support for list-based access. I'm going to say it's also admin so that I can still access to the actuator endpoint. But I can also create any config key I want, right? So let's say I'm going to create foo counter, which does not exist, and the ID tell you so immediately. I don't know about that key. And I'm going to use that in the info endpoint. So I'm going to say info. For those who don't know, info is a map, and we take every key of that map and we expose that in the info endpoint. So basically, if you have info.foo equals something, then you'll have an entry foo equals something in the info endpoint. What you would use typically is you're going to expose the name of the service, the version of the service, or any metadata that you want to expose. So if you want a quick example of that, because Spring.io is a Spring Boot application, so if I go on the info endpoint, then I get this. So that's the typical information that you would expose, right? Yeah. Come again?
Is that actuator doing that?
Yeah, the info endpoint is the actuator, yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to say counter, and we're going to reuse our key, and we can see that we have also links between keys. I can see that the value will be 42. And I can say, oh yeah, I forgot to mention that you can see that the key is in a special highlight just to show you that it's actually the key of a map, the key entry basically. And finally, as we will see later, Yann is going to showcase that. We also have additional support for special keys. So for instance, we have one in Spring Boot that's logging.level. You can see that it's a map. And basically, you can use that to tune the logging configuration regardless of the logging system that you're using. So there you get basically two smart autocompletion for that. You get smart autocompletion for the key, right? And you also get smart autocompletion for the value. And we'll come back to that later in this presentation. All right. There's a typo. Oh, right. Missing E. Thank you. Then if I restart that, I'll have to log in, obviously, again. I just want to show you that everything works as expected. So first of all, I get this auto-configuration report because I flipped the auto-configure package to debug. So that's the first effect. Then if I go back to my service, it says hello2. That's the random value. And change me. And then basically I have this bar and whatever, right? But the point I'm trying to make here is, OK, these are maybe not the customization that you're looking for. But if you're working with a Spring Boot application and you want to figure out what kind of options you have, you can type a few characters in that file and figure out basically live what kind of options you have. You also get validation out of the box as long as you activate the validate on build, which is in this section. So compiler, validation, validate on build. So what's new in 15 is the Spring file set is created automatically for you, auto-detected for you. So you know this foo counter is unknown. So it basically tells me so here, down below. I don't know about that key. And if I put some crap, so this is obviously not an index, and I try to restart my app, then it won't restart. It's telling me basically, OK, there's something wrong in your config file, so please fix that. You can obviously decide whether or not you want to run those validations, but if you activate that, it's pretty handy. Right?
All right, take over. And I want to show you some of the stuff which is coming in Spring Boot 1.3. There's a whole lot of new metadata introduced into Spring Boot 1.3, and the IDE can actually make use of that metadata to enhance the completion navigation we just saw for some of those keys. In IntelliJ 14, we had some manual mapping of some known keys to some known type or to some known behavior for that key. And that has been generalized and can be used from the metadata which is built or packaged into the Spring Boot distribution. So any IDE can make use of that information for the user. So the first thing I'm going to show you is enhanced support for deprecating keys. So when I start and type some key part name which contains some deprecated keys, you will see on the bottom of this completion list, the deprecated keys are sorted automatically to the last position because it's most unlikely to be used, hopefully. And if I choose such a key, you will see the highlighting in the editor. It's strike true, so you see immediately that your application, for example, after upgrading to a new version of Spring Boot, is using a deprecated or no deprecated key. And it also tells you in the pop-up here. And what is new in Spring Boot 1.3 metadata is that not only can you deprecate a key, but you can also define Let me just adjust the font size here. A so-called replacement key. So we see that this key is deprecated, and we have a reference to the now current key, or the updated key, which you should be using. So you can go and change that manually, but that's stupid because we already know about it, and we all know our favorite shortcut, which is Alt-Enter to trigger an intention or a quick fix in IntelliJ, and we'll use the new intention to replace that key to the new replacement key, and we are done. That's the stuff about deprecation. We can also add metadata about the reason for this deprecation, so you can tell the user why that deprecation was introduced into the release.
There is none here because we screwed up the name, so we didn't want to let you know.
Okay. Another area which was enhanced is support for given value lists. So if you have some property which is a string type value, it's not typed, so usually you want to provide a list of known values for that key, and that is now possible in the Spring Boot 1.3 release metadata. And one example of this is this key, which has a list of known values which are valid for this configuration key. And we enhanced also the documentation view for keys with known value lists. You can see this table here on the left side, the values which are valid, and on the right side, there's a description which is also stored in the metadata of Spring Boot to give you some hints about what this value is going to trigger at runtime. And you also see the documentation here in the completion pop-up, so it's very easy to figure out what that value is going to do at runtime. Another big improvement is built-in support from, for...
Yeah, I should mention by now that Yann is actually typing on a French layout keyboard.
Yeah, which is kind of weird, but I'm trying to, so please bear with me while I try to find the keys. For enums. So enums, of course, have a fixed set of values, the enum custom fields, which are valid, and this key refers to an enum acknowledge mode in this case, which has the values which are automatically proposed now in the completion pop-up here. Again, you can see the documentation, which is actually taken on the fly from the Java doc of this enum. So even if you have like your own configuration keys and you refer to some enum property, and since you're a good developer, you will have written some Java doc on that, anyone can figure out what this enum value is going to do. And again, the same value list and overview is available in the documentation view here as well. I mean, it's basically the same thing as a fixed set of manually defined values. Again, value and description taken from Java doc, very easy to understand, and to provide content assistance for your users of your boot and extension. Okay, another type which is now treated specially are configuration properties referring to a class. So let me find one. Spring data source type, for example. And the documentation tells us that this is a fully qualified name of the connection pool implementation Spring Boot should be using. It's usually auto-detected, but just for demonstration purposes, this key is a very nice demo. Control space, and you get automatically filtered list of completion proposals of any class matching the required base class, data source in that case, and you can just hit return and be done. One thing to mention is wherever you have some value which refers to a package or to a class or something like that, it fully supports refactoring. So anytime you change your class, all references which are used in the values here in your configuration files will be refactored automatically for you. So it really understands the connection between classes, packages, whatever, and the declaration of that. Right. Yeah. I'm sorry? Okay. So yeah. So the question. Yeah. So the question was, how do we find out about these values? How do we know what to propose, right? We are going to look at that in a few minutes when we take a look at the actual metadata behind all this magic, and we are going to add some demo about this. Okay? Right. Another thing which is quite common is content type, for example. And here you get a full list of known registered contents types, so it's very easy to choose the one you want.
That's a Spring media type, by the way, if you wonder.
Right, yeah. So that will be there automatically for any property which is of that type. And a similar thing is available for encoding. So maybe you need or want to set some encoding, for example, for sending mails or whatever. And here again, you get the full list of known encodings, so it's very easy to provide completion for that as well.
What if we change the banner?
Right, yeah. So everyone loves the Spring Boot banner on the front, especially our friend Josh. And this banner can actually be changed. So maybe you want to have your company banner or the banner of your project you're working on, and that's very easy to do. So the property for that is banner.location, and it has a default value of a class path resource. So this is actually a Spring IO resource reference or property which can be modified by you. So let's do it. Let's add our own banner, and I'll just, let's call it Spring1, for example. So Spring1.txt. I'm going to create the file in the class path. And Stéphane was nice enough to prepare a live template with a great looking Spring1 logo. And as you would expect by now, IntelliJ knows that this is a reference to a class path resource, offers navigation, completion, and again, of course, refactoring. So any Spring IO.resource type will be handled in the same way automatically if you have such configuration properties in your own metadata. Right. Did I miss one?
No.
No, that's it. Okay.
Probably about to showcase the other format.
Yes, the YAML format is something new in IntelliJ 15. Be careful, it's still work in progress. It has some known quirks. I'm going to work on them very soon. But many people ask about it. So we had to do something because for unknown reasons to me, some people prefer YAML. So let's increase the font size here.
Yeah, so basically you get the exact same auto-completion as you would expect in property
Again,
file.
we are using the same metadata here. It's just in YAML instead. Again, you can control-click here, go to the definition of this key, show the documentation of this key. It's more or less the same level of application properties support. Still, it has some things which are missing yet, but we really want to have the same level here. So you have the free choice of whatever configuration format you prefer in your projects. Right, so we still got this yellow bugger here.
Yeah.
foo.counter.
We should fix that, right?
Yeah. It has a nice value, but still Spring Boot, or rather IntelliJ, tells me that it doesn't know anything about it, which is clear because all the other keys we've been using now in the configuration file have some kind of metadata behind it. So now we are going to look at how this magic is going to happen, right? There has been a quick fix already in IntelliJ 14 to define such additional metadata, which is basically some manual way to define configuration keys and give them some magic. So again, Alt-Enter is your best friend, and we have a quick fix to define this configuration key, which is not to be found in the existing metadata yet. So there are some rules behind this. Such additional metadata must be defined in a file called additional Spring configuration metadata.json, and it shall be stored in a resources root in your project. We don't have such files, so IntelliJ asked me whether I want to create this file and offers me a list of known resource roots. So we only have one here, so I'm going to create it here. And this is basically the magic behind all this configuration key completion, navigation, and stuff like that. It's basically metadata stored in JSON, and we will take a look at what exactly can be or must be defined here. So the first thing is, of course, the name property. So it has to have a unique name. Type will define the type of this configuration key. We are going to change it here because 42 is obviously, or rather a number than a string maybe. Again, auto-completion, full refactoring is support here as well. And then there's this key description. And IntelliJ already provided some dummy texts for us. And there's one funny thing here. This description text has some rules behind it. Just like Java doc, the first sentence will be used for short description. And that is the short description we previously saw in the auto-completion list when we had the completion for enum values, for example, where it took just the first sentence of the Java doc to just show it as a quick documentation, and the full documentation would be shown in the full Java, in the full documentation view pop-up we had with the value and description table. So since there are some rules to that, we can trigger it. It's maybe a bit hard to see here on the beamer, but there is an error now. We don't have a dot after the first sentence, and IntelliJ reminds us to have this dot after the first sentence so that the IDE can extract a useful first quick documentation. So what else can we define here? Quite a few things, actually.
Yeah, default value.
Default value would be the next thing. We saw some properties which have a default value, like, for example, the banner location we did as last thing. Again, this is auto-completion here. IntelliJ knows what can be here in this metadata and what not at what position. So we are going to set 42. I'm sorry? I didn't understand.
Get it either.
No, I was just asking for the exact point of what all values are probably hard-coded.
Yeah, there are some rules to this metadata. They are defined in the Spring Boot reference documentation. So
if you go to the Spring Boot documentation reference, you'll have a section, an advanced section that basically tells you how you can deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
And if you're wondering at this point if you guys have to write that by hand for every single property that you have, it's probably a nightmare, right? Nobody does that. So we're going to show you how you can generate that automatically. But just for completeness, because sometimes, and particularly we do, there's edge case where you can't use the automated way for some reason. So we needed a way to also be able to specify them manually. We actually use that extensively in Spring Boot itself. So we're going to show you that now, and after we're going to show you what you're really supposed to use.
Right.
But that clarifies how it works behind the scenes.
Okay.
Hopefully.
So there's a couple more of properties. Just a quick reference. We have deprecation, so we saw that in action before. I can give it a reason for deprecation. So
you want to deprecate my counter already?
No.
Okay.
Just showcasing.
Thank you.
And as we saw, there is the possibility to specify a replacement key. Again, we have auto-completion here, and again, we have auto-completion here to refer to the other key we want the user to use in the future. Of course, this is all unnecessary for our demonstration, so I'm going to delete that. And maybe you noticed this red banner on top of the editor. It's a bit too small to read on the screen. It says Spring Boot configuration annotation processor not found on ClassPath. So the question is, how does this JSON get processed into something we can use in the IDE or at runtime to use this metadata? And as you would guess, there's an annotation processor involved in this magic, which will take our additional Spring config metadata, process it in some way, mix it with some other way, Stéphane is going to demonstrate after me, and generate the metadata we actually are going to use in the IDE. So this is the source file format for metadata, for manual metadata. It will get transformed into something slightly different, but not too different. So we have to fix this. Let's go to our Maven.
It would be so nice if I could do Alt-Enter on the banner and it would add a dependency for me.
Yes,
Can you
it would
do
be
that,
nice, and it will be done.
Okay, he said it would be done, so it's recorded, you know that?
Yeah, shit.
Okay.
Sorry. So we have to find this Spring Boot configuration processor, add it as a dependency, and since it's an annotation processor, it is an optional dependency. So don't forget to add optional true here. And
so that's basically running as part of your compiler.
Right.
So it's only required by the compilation phase. So it's going basically to look at the source of your project and do something with it. We'll see in a minute what it does on top of it. But right now what it does is, what we're going to showcase is, it parses this additional metadata file, validates it, and then generate a file at a standard location in your jar file, or in the jar file of this project, actually. And then the IDE can pick that up for you.
Right. So first, I'm going to tell IntelliJ to import my changes in POM.
And then the banner should not be red anymore.
Then the banner should not be red,
Okay.
but gray. So what it reads now is rerun the Spring Boot configuration annotation processor to update the generated metadata. So we're going to do this. Rebuild the project. The annotation processor will kick in now. Yeah, we still have that warning, so we need to run it once again. And we can actually now look at what the annotation processor did here. This is the resulting metadata the annotation processor now generated from our additional metadata, where we specified some manual keys and manual properties for those keys. It doesn't look too different from what we just edited manually, but maybe you noticed already there is some other property hints here, which is empty because we didn't specify any. So something happened. And now to close the circle, our foo counter property is now a known property in the IDE and at runtime for Spring Boot. We get the same level of support we saw for the Spring Boot configuration keys, which come with Spring Boot. So we have a description. We can specify all sorts of additional metadata we want to store in this key. And I can control-click on that, and it will actually take me to the metadata declaration in my project because it knows that this is an additional key I specified in this very configuration file. So whenever I need to change something, I can just control-click there and continue editing the metadata. Right. So far about the manual metadata. It sounds quite complicated, but it actually isn't very complicated. But now Stéphane will show you what you really want to do in your own projects.
Right. So yeah, the thing to remember here is, of what Yann just shown, is this is a custom key, right? So see that as, if you have an application and you want to expose configuration keys, or if you have a library that you share among several teams and you want to let them know how they can use your app or your library, then you can expose those metadata, and as long as they use an IDE that supports the metadata, which they all do now, so they will support, obviously, in IntelliJ IDEA, in STS, and in NetBeans now, they can actually get live documentation from your stuff. So I want to extend that a little bit and to show you some new metadata that we've introduced in Spring Boot 1.3. The first one is ints. Okay, I'm not on the right place. Ints is basically a way to provide additional information about the key. And there's two things you can do with it. You can provide values. So you already saw that with the demonstration with the Hibernate, the DDL auto flag. And I can provide the description and something like this, right? And for the sake of the demo, I'm going to add an extra value. Something like that, right? So if I add that metadata, then I get additional assistance in the IDE, hopefully. I need to make. That's probably what I missed. So you get the same auto-completion as the one you saw earlier, right? But remember, that's your own keys, okay? Not the one in Spring Boot. So the other thing, of course, if I'm doing this, then it's red now. Because I provided two values, and I didn't provide it any extra information. So what Spring Boot considers and IntelliJ IDEA considers is that that's the list of values that this key can hold. And if you provide a value that's not in that list, then that's not a valid value. I want to make sure that any extra value can be provided. So basically, the list of values should be considered as special values, but any extra value might do as well. So for that, I'm going to show you an extra feature, which is called provider. So let's create that. So provider is actually special names that are provided in Spring Boot metadata 1.3. So we provide a list of official providers, and then the IDE are supposed to pick that up and support auto-completion for those. So these are the ones that we support for the moment. So what I'm going to show you now is any, which means the value is just a hint, and any extra value will do. Obviously, it needs to be an integer, but any extra value will do. So if I select that and rebuild, then my thing will go away, right? I can provide any extra value now. Do I have time for the extra thing? Yeah. We do, right? Yeah. OK. So I want to show you one more thing regarding extra metadata. So for that, let me create an extra property. Let's say it's java.lang.string. And I think that's it, right? It's good enough. But let's see that for some reason, and many of you may have that, this is actually not a simple string. This is the name of a Spring Bean. For some reason, you need to externalize, and we actually do in some auto-configuration item, you need to externalize the name of the bean that's going to be used for whatever service. So it would be nice, instead of this raw string, if you could get some assistance from the IDE listing you all the beans that are defined matching a certain type. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to create an extra int entry here. I'm going to say foobar. I'm going to say I want the provider. And let's see, Spring Bean reference. And that requires some parameters. All that is described in the documentation. So you get full content assistance again. So I'm going to say, not to confuse you, let's say that I have 2 beans of type integer in my app. I don't for the moment. So let's do that. So bean, you should never do that, by the way, right? A bean of type integer is really bad. Don't do that. So I'm just adding those beans to my project. Okay? So if I go to my configuration now, or any configuration that has this module as a dependency, then I have the auto-completion again, and I get this nice completion of the options that are available to me. And I also get full linking, so I can basically go to the bean declaration if I need to.
And again, refactoring is supported here as well. So if you're going to rename your bean, it will pick up the new bean name in your configuration file.
Yes.
It does.
I never tried that. That's the first time. OK. So long for the manual metadata. That's all interesting and stuff, but it looks a bit advanced. So I want to step back a bit. Now you've seen what happens behind the scenes and show you the regular use case. So the regular use case is, let's say that you have a hello service, right? So let's write it down right now. And you want to configure that hello service. Let's flag that as a service. You want to configure that with some properties. So let's gather those into a file. And let's create that file. So I want to do two things. I want to say I have a prefix for the hello message. That's hello. Some Java doc. And I want a target, so the thing to say hello to. And I'm not providing any value for that. Target of the welcome message. And I want to make sure it's specified, so I'm just going to add some constraint to it. OK, so that's just a regular POJO. There's nothing fancy about it. But what I'm going to add an extra property. I'm going to say it's a configuration properties with a certain prefix. What that's going to do, once you enable that support in Spring Boot, it's going to be able to map any key, well, keys that are starting with the hello prefix to this bean. So typically, if in your configuration you say hello.prefix, it's going to call the setPrefix method. If you type hello.target, it will call the setTarget method, basically. So the interesting part is this, which is basically giving the namespace of the keys. And then after that, the properties are basically the name of the configuration key for that namespace. All right, so if I go back to my service, now it's resolved. So I'm going to do field injection. I see that Oli is in the back, so he's probably going to like that. So no, don't do field injection, and he's not listening to me. You'll see that on the recording, I guess. And let's say hello when the application starts, right? So let's say this, not coding there, that's not going to work. Is the property is the prefix. And properties.target. So if I do that, so I have a service that when it's initialized, inject the properties, process them, and basically say hello, which is not really interesting. And we have our banner working here, as you can see. And for those who are following, it obviously should fail, right? Because we never said that we want to process that file. We never said do something with it, right? So for that, I'm going to add an extra annotation on my configuration class. I'm going to say enable configuration properties, and I'm going to specify the name of the properties object. There are other options. So for instance, you can specify enable configuration properties without any argument and define your properties object as components, and they will be picked up by component scanning automatically. So if I do that again, trust me if you can't read the exception message, it's going to fail again because the value is not set. So that's the validation issue. Yeah. So let me put that a bit bigger for you. Rejected value, so target is null. OK, so let's give a value for that thing that we have to, right? Oh, I have auto-completion already. Okay? So that's what this annotation processor is primarily doing. Scanning your source code for POJO annotated with configuration properties and figuring out the kind of keys that are going to be exposed. And looking at the source code, so you can see that the default value was taken. You can see that the JavaDoc was taken away from the field. So this is really the standard use case. You create a configuration properties POJO. You inject that into whatever service you have. And you add the annotation processor to your project. And basically, you get auto-completion out of the box. So let's say something like that, just to prove that it works. So you should have some hello world somewhere. Whoa, that's a lot.
You can use Control F.
Yeah, that's probably over there.
There it is.
There it is, yeah, okay. Right, hello world. Okay, so that's the kind of thing you can do very quickly. The configuration hierarchy you can use is very complete, so you can do a bunch of stuff. Obviously, I'm a bit lazy for the sake of the demo, so I'm exposing two strings, which is not really strongly typed. But as Yann shown you, whatever class, whatever type you expose, it will be exposed in the metadata as well. So if you expose a class of type foo, then it will look for all implementation of foo and autocomplete the value directly. There is nothing you have to do, no int to write. You just write your code as you would expect. We generate the metadata for it, and the IDE picks that up. So there's one problem with my configuration here, is that target is really a weird name. So I want to use name instead and not target, right? So I'm going to create getters and setters for those. And I'm going to say that these are deprecated because that was a bad decision. We should have done that. And just delegate to the new API, basically. OK. So far, so good. But the problem is I would like, since I'm basically managing, so if someone is still using hello.target, it will still work because the setter is still present, right? But I want to let users know that hello.target is no longer a valid property, and I want them to use hello.name. That's the new property I want them to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extra annotation here from Spring Boot with a reason and a replacement, right? And if I build, did I build? No, I didn't. So if I build and I go back to my config, then hello target is deprecated. And I can see right away why it's deprecated. Okay? And as you would expect, then you have the magic replacement. So that works also declaratively from your code. So yeah, that's really the real use case you should use with that stuff. So designing your API, designing your configuration properties, and let the Spring Boot configuration processor generate the metadata automatically for you.
Right. So let's switch to some quite different topic, since we spent quite some time, but I think it's important to understand how these configuration keys can work and how you can create your own configuration universe for your application or services. Let's actually talk about how to run and or debug your Spring Boot applications. There is a special run configuration type for Spring Boot applications. We saw that after creating this template project with Spring Initializer, it automatically created this run configuration. And the way it works is that any module containing exactly one Spring Boot application class will be considered to be a standalone Spring Boot application, microservice, whatever you call it. And corresponding run configuration will be created automatically for you, so you can just go ahead and run it. Just have to specify the main class, VM options, program arguments, whatever. And then comes the interesting part, the specialization for running Spring Boot applications. So that's this part here. We can just with the single checkbox enable debug output by default. That's another argument you could pass on the command line to Spring Boot, but you can use this checkbox here. People who don't like the Spring Boot banner or their own boot banner can hide it with the checkbox as well.
Don't click on that.
I won't click because somebody really hates me for building that feature. And the real interesting thing is now this little table, override parameters. So what does it do? We have our configuration files with keys and values. So if you encounter some problem or you want to run an A/B test or some kind of variation of your configuration, you would need to modify your configuration file, or you would have to create a profile of this configuration file and run with that profile. But it's much easier just to override selected keys with a different value, and just for the runtime. So we don't have to modify the source code. This is IDE-specific metadata. It won't get stored in your source repository unless you tell it to do it. So I can add additional configuration keys. I have full auto-completion here as well, just like in the config file. So maybe I want to change the banner.
Port. Or the port.
The port, yeah. Let's change the port, the server port, and let's maybe change it to...
Why do you change, do you want to change my banner again? What's wrong with it?
No, I don't want to change the banner.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, let's change the server port. We want to run to 8001 maybe. And as you can see in the first column, there's this checkbox enabled. So why is that here? We can quickly enable and disable overriding parameters to just switch between different configurations more or less on the fly without doing something else than just unchecking a checkbox. The other thing you can easily do is to create a copy of an existing run configuration and modify it with some parameters, and then you can run whatever version of your app you want to run with different overriding parameters. So when we run this now, and by the way, IntelliJ knows that this application is already running and will ask you to stop and rerun it, so you don't end up with two instances, hopefully.
Which would have worked because we changed the port.
Because we changed the port, yeah.
That was my idea.
So when we go to 8001, it works, right?
Okay.
I think that's the stuff about the run configuration. We have some more things in the plans, but I think this is a nice and easy way to quickly tune your application and just debug it with some different properties.
Okay, so the other thing that you can do also with Spring Boot is profile management. So by default, Spring Boot is actually going to read any application dash the name of the profile when it's enabled. So let's create a dev profile here. And for the sake of the dev profile, I'm going to say security. I'm going to disable security altogether, right? What I'm going also to do is in my demo app, I'm going to create a bean. Let's quickly create a controller which only is enabled with profile dev. It used to be actually auto-configuration for the H2 console, if you know that. But since then, we have auto-configuration support for it, so I can't show that anymore. And instead, I can show you the most useful controller ever, right? I think that's really, really nice. It's a string there. Okay. So if I go here like Yann shown already, I can say, oh, no. What I want to do instead is I want to have two run configurations. So I want to have one for development and one for whatever other profile I want to use. So I'm going to use the copy run config here and simply just say that I want the dev profile, right? And let's say I don't want that instead. So if I run again, I should get whatever for the sake of the demo, right? It's more a Spring feature, but oh yeah, for one, I should not have any security in place. and my debug thing is available, right? Not super interesting, unless that for some reason you want to rename that profile. And if you do, with the usual shortcut, then IntelliJ IDEA will actually detect that you have a Spring Boot configuration for that profile, and it will basically offer you to rename the file as well.
Right. Okay. We looked at Spring Boot specific stuff. We are now going to make a short excursion into a bit more general Spring features in IntelliJ. I'm sorry?
Is that okay to run profile as well? So if I click on run the demo application then, would the profile need to be updated in the runtime?
No, it doesn't yet. Good question. But it will be possible, yeah. Usually you don't rename your profiles every day, so it should be hopefully quite safe, but good catch. Right. Going to some more general stuff, how can you navigate your Spring application in IntelliJ IDEA? So we have Spring Boot application annotation, which is a meta annotation. It includes a component scan for the current package. It includes a configuration annotation. So we have this little icon here, which allows us to navigate to the actual beans or the controllers which have been created due to this configuration. So that's very easy to navigate from this application, for example, to the debugged controller, which is now in the same file, but otherwise it would open the corresponding class for us. And we can also do the way back, so I can navigate to the declaring configuration using the same mechanism, and now the cursor jump to demo application, which is actually the configuration responsible for creating this REST controller, which is linked below. There is a somewhat related feature, which is very powerful. It's called Navigate Related Symbol. And what that does is really context dependent. It actually works in other frameworks or other technologies as well, and it provides some kind of semantic navigation. So for example, in Spring MVC, you have your controller and you have your view. And IntelliJ understands the relation between those two and offers you to navigate between those two by using this function related symbol. And the same thing can work for navigating from the configuration file to the beans. And another use case, which is again Spring Boot specific, when you are in your application properties file and you want to go to the metadata file, your additional metadata file you wrote, you can use the same shortcut here, navigate related symbol, and it will open the additional JSON file. So one shortcut to learn and many, many navigation possibilities in Spring MVC, in Grails. It works in many frameworks actually. So we use some navigation from an already opened editor to some related stuff. There's another shortcut which is very powerful to navigate to anything from anywhere. So if I want to find a bean by name, I can use a shortcut. It's called go to symbol, and that includes Spring beans. So I should be able to find the debug controller here, and I can jump there. So if you can even only guess parts of the name, it will also match with pattern matching and camel case matching bean names and propose them in this completion pop-up. And you can quickly go to any bean definition from anywhere, just wherever you are. Okay, there's another possibility to explore what is happening Spring-wise in your application. And that's the Spring tool window below here. So what it does is it shows all the file sets, which are more or less a representation of your Spring application contexts per module. We can also join all modules if you don't want to group them by module. We can also disable different file sets, so you can put all beans in one big list if you rather prefer that. And what you see here is a quite long list of auto configuration classes, which have been triggered due to the Spring Boot application, which enables auto-configuration. So these are all the auto-configuration classes which Spring Boot automatically adds to your Spring Boot application in this case. And we should also find our debug controller in here, demo application. And those are all the beans which are configured via our demo application. I can use quick search here and quickly navigate to the debug controller again. So that's another way to access beans and to understand the structure of your configuration and the resulting beans. On the right, we can see some meta information. We can see that it's a controller bean. We see the source, and we even see that this is limited to the profile development. So this bean will only be available in that profile. Right. So another last thing for navigation is actually, I'm going to reset the selection. So it actually works. There's a very powerful shortcut which is called select in. And what that does is take the element your cursor is on and provide your navigation targets, mostly tool windows, where you actually want to select that very element you are in now. And that works for Spring Beans as well. So Alt F1, and I get a list of tool windows which are available as navigation targets. And one of them is the Spring Beans tool window. So if I select that, it will select the corresponding file set, the corresponding configuration, and select the debug controller for me. And I can go there and see what is related to that bean, what other beans are in this context, in this configuration. So that's a very nice and quick way to open the Spring Beans view right from the current bean, from the current configuration. Okay, that is all good but old. And I'm going to show you something which is very new.
Very new, yeah.
Very new.
Like last night or what?
Like last night, yeah. No, it has been there for a few weeks, but it has mostly gone unnoticed apparently so far in the community. And I think this is one of the most interesting new features for Spring development in general in the upcoming 15 version. And so we solved navigating beans, right? I showed you a few ways how to do that, and it's all nice and easy to use. But some Spring applications suffer from a quite complex or complicated and sometimes a bit non-managed setup of their configuration. So when you join a new project or you have new hires and they really have trouble figuring out what is the structure of your Spring configuration context, where does this bean come from? Why is it there? How are these configuration files, for example, related to each other? And we thought about this, and we came up with an idea to show a graph of the actual configuration happening in your application. So this is a real synthetic project. It does not have any meaning. It's just for demonstration purposes. And so you invoke diagrams, show diagram, and here's the new diagram type, Spring Model Dependencies. So let's maximize this a bit. Right. So what this shows is on the left, the module node. Then we have two file sets here, or two created contexts. And then it shows the main configuration files, for example, b.xml.
Excellent.
Yeah, just for completeness. Of course, nobody is going to use XML anymore. But as you can see, there are different shapes and different arrows and colors here, visualizing the relationship between all those configuration files. So for example, if you have imports, if you have component scans, which in turn trigger another set of configuration beans, you would really have a hard time to understand those relations by just looking at the code or by just guessing what this component scan might trigger or might not trigger at runtime. So I think this is a very nice possibility to actually see what your Spring configuration does. You can also see quite some problems. We have a couple of red edges here, which show cycles or configuration properties, configuration problems. We have a couple of tooltips here showing where this relation is actually defined. I can select this node, press F4, and go to that exact location in your configuration file, be it XML or Java config, and you will get to the exact point triggering this relationship we saw on the graph. So I think that's a very powerful feature to understand what is happening behind the scenes, how your setup is actually structured or not structured, and you can use this graph to verify that your configuration is what you actually expect it to be at application runtime. This is all good and new. We are thinking about a few additions to that, so stay tuned. We are thinking about stuff like refactoring configuration setups, like moving imports between different files automatically for you. Using this graph, we can just use drag and drop and change Spring configuration for you and generate the corresponding code needed for changing the setup. So I think this will really help to structure applications and understand whatever was or has been configured in the last few years in bigger applications. Well, I guess we are done with our demo here, right. And we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah. Any question? Don't be shy, please. No question?
I'm sorry? No. Actually, the graph is based on the Spring facet configuration in your application. So we didn't show that. We have here a facet with a couple of facets, and they have some main configuration files. And all the rest of the graph, which also nicely demonstrates the power, is actually triggered by those main entry point configurations. Right. So as long as you have the Spring facet setup in place, it will just use that data. I actually missed one thing, which is the same thing works actually for Spring Boot. So there is quite some magic with Spring Boot and auto configuration, right? I mean, we saw this long list of auto configurations which have been shown in the Spring Beans Explorer. And I'm just going to trigger this diagram in a Spring Boot application. So this is the basic setup of our application, right? Very easy to understand, nothing to worry about, and that's the beauty of Spring Boot, in my opinion. So there's not much to worry about. And usually in most Spring Boot applications, you won't have a much more complex graph than what we see right here, at least not per module or per microservice, right? So things become different when I switch on configuration nodes which are not located in the project, but in libraries, so coming from Spring Boot automatically. And this is actually the full graph, or a limited set of the auto configuration graph, which Spring Boot will create at runtime for me, right? So this is quite impressive. And this is basically the magic behind Spring Boot and the auto configuration. As you can see, the Spring Boot application node triggers a quite impressive list of auto configuration classes, which in turn import another set of configuration classes and whatnot. So this is a nice visualization of what Spring auto configuration actually does at runtime. And a nice possibility for you to understand why some auto configuration is actually not there, even if you expect it. Maybe you choose a wrong jar or wrong dependency, or you forgot to set some flag. And we are working very hard to really show the actual graph that will be used at runtime. You can switch on debugging, as we saw when Stéphane was switching the debug level to show what Spring Boot actually does with auto configuration, because there's quite a few conditions that apply to enable or disable specific auto configurations. But we really strive to have the same view here on this graph, so you can see what your application will do at runtime without actually starting and debugging it in the run configuration.
Is that view searchable?
It is, yeah. Yeah.
What kind of licenses do you have? Like, is it free or do we need to pay for it?
No, this is Spring support is only in the paid edition of IntelliJ.
Spring support is edition. It's paid.
Yeah, it's in the paid version only. Yeah.
And does it support WebSphere as a server?
Yes, it does support WebSphere. Yeah.
There was a question in the back, yeah.
The graph is awesome, by the way.
Thanks.
Is there a way to see a legend?
We are thinking about that. Yeah. The question was, is there some kind of legend for this graph, right? There is a tooltip here which shows you what this is and what it triggers. So for this specific node, it shows the number of imported resources. For configuration classes, it will show the number of actually linked beans. So we have all this information. We are still thinking of what kind of information is really necessary or useful on this graph, and maybe some kind of property table might be a good solution, so you can actually cycle through those nodes and inspect them more thoroughly. So yeah, something like that might be coming. Welcome. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, will application YAML config file support be on par with application to property support? Yes, we are going to try it. It's a bit more difficult than having the same support on application properties, because YAML is a bit more complex by itself, but we really want to have a decent support in the upcoming version 15. Yeah, okay.
What would happen if you tried printing?
When I try to what?
Printing.
Oh, you can actually print it, yeah. You can actually also export it as a PNG or a SVG file. So that's very nice and handy if you want to have the big wall of Spring madness in your project office. Yeah, this is actually the full configuration graph. What I just showed you in the Spring Boot demo application was a limited set. We already filtered some of the auto configurations by the conditions that apply to those auto configurations. This is actually the maximum of auto configurations you can get in Spring Boot. It has all the dependencies of Spring Boot 1.3, and
everything you could auto-configure,
everything you could get for free.
Filter some of that stuff out?
Yeah, that might be another feature, to filter groups out, to limit the graph by some set of flags, whatever. Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to discuss a bit more with us, do not hesitate. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much.